So, the title was, Can the West be integralized? Without Christianity, and of course it can be. But that's just the short answer, and I'm going to try a little bit longer answer.
Can you turn the mic up? Does it go up?
Just hold it like this, and it'll be fine.
That's great. You want to close it?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Yeah, thanks.
Gibbs, of course, found that the integral was, emerging, people were saying, Christianity was at its end, and so perhaps many people assumed that the integral was going to develop within the purely secular context. But my question is, can it be? Is integralism something that can be nurtured within a secular context, or does it need some help, from religion? And it seemed like Christianity was not interested in integralism, so integralists could go on without it. This talk is really, it's kind of the central theme is the encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si. To me, it signals that the church is interested in integralism, and I'll be telling you why. And I think if Christianity and the Pope seems to be, revitalizing it, wants to be part of integral, whatever it is, and I think that we can't escape Christianity, whatever our feelings are about it. In the West, it's so much part of the fabric of our culture that it's going to remain so, I think. And I don't think integralists particularly want to get rid of Christianity or overcome it or anything. They want to integrate it, right? That's what we want to do. So, all right. So the most widely promoted contributor to integralism from the Christian point of view was Teilhard de Chardin. But unfortunately, his influence fell on infertile church land, and he was, silenced during his lifetime. He died in 1955, and his writings weren't published till, after that. So, the encyclical, which came out, I think, in May, makes it clear that Teilhard is on the up and up in the church. He was first applauded, as it were, by the previous Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis is continuing with that rehabilitation of Teilhard. So, now the fourth chapter of the encyclical is entitled Integral Ecology. And I was particularly drawn to that. I published the book on integral ecology a few decades ago. And so I was happy to see that seed, is taking hold and flourishing at the highest level of the church. So there are bridges being built between Catholicism and the integral community, and invitations for crossing over. And I propose to analyze parts of the encyclical for its relevance to integral theory. So now Teilhard has had, his most significant influence on Catholics and other Christians impatient with the medieval spirituality and cosmology of the church, but it had very little influence on the church itself. Teilhard's influence on the dialogue between science and spirituality, I think, earns him he should be named the patron saint of that endeavor. Today, the dialogue between science and religion involves voices from all the world's religions, but churches have been ambivalent, towards science. The door between them has only been half open at best, but Pope Francis seems to have opened the door wider, so the opportunity for progress in this dialogue beckons. The challenge to the church is not only the entrenched materialism of science, but that this dialogue simultaneously puts the different religions in dialogue with each other. The dialogue of science and religion goes hand in hand with comparative theology, and comparative theology in turn opens another door to yet other parties interested in the dialogue, such as transpersonal psychology and esotericists and other groups that are usually not welcome by the vested interests of the churches and science. Are we entering then into a new age of openness? How did the Vatican come to integralism? Could the choice of this word have come from familiarity with such exponents of integralism as Gebser or Lindo, Wilbur, and writers associated with this institute? Hopefully, there might be a connection. But Pope Francis uses the word integral to emphasize the relationship between eco-justice and social justice, echoing also his redemption of liberation theology. Francis is focusing on the detrimental effects of climate change, especially on the poor, those doubly victimized by both socioeconomic injustice and deteriorating sustainability. If we refer to these two causes as a horizontal dimension, Pope Francis also insists on the relevance of the vertical dimension of spirituality and morality on the issue in this respect. There's an overlap with the theoretical concerns of the integral community. More likely, integralism may have entered the vocabulary of the encyclical through the Teilhardian community. Thomas Berry, a Catholic priest based at Fordham University, managed to plug Teilhardian theology into a news story while melding in insights from the world's religions without drawing censure from Ratzinger's Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. The American Teilhard Association and the Yale Forum of Religion and Environment, both headed presently by Teilhardian scholars Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, had a pretty good grip on what was in the encyclical before it was published. So I emailed Tucker and asked her, where did the Vatican get their interest in integralism from? And she replied, Thomas Berry. That was the extent of her email. So, if so, wow, that's like really exciting news. It means that the rehabilitation of Teilhard de Chardin, begun by Pope Benedict, has taken a big step forward. Having been repressed in his native church, Teilhard was embraced by the motley integral community outside the church. Now the church wants it back. Right? Mm-hmm. So the church has started to wade into the integral dialogue. This could certainly influence the ongoing development of integral theory. Before that happens, though, the church has to sort out the love-hate relationship it has to Teilhard. Even very recently, the Vatican was at tiff with the American nuns, supposedly for, not being gung-ho on abortion and some of the, sexual issues of morality. But what may have really irked them was their interest in Teilhardian ideas. They had invited Barbara Marx Hubbard to speak at their national convention, and that hurt a lot of the conservative stalwarts in the church who still, thought that Teilhard was a heretic. So anyway, there you have it. Nuns, inspired by the idea of conscious evolution. I think society should be sending them invitations to these conferences. My own introduction to integralism took place here. I was a student here at the Institute for several years in the 70s. And I was a student of Dr. Teilhard de Chardin, and actually lived in his ashram on Fulton Street for a while. And I admired him because he wasn't, a straight and narrow follower of Aurobindo. He's made many unique contributions. And I was sorry to see that nobody was speaking of him, so I'm just making a plug for him. I think the Gebserian approach, to integralism is similar in its openness to different approaches into the integral, and that's what just serves as a good meeting ground for exponents of various types of integral thought, be they Gebserians, Aurobindonians, Wilberians, process thinkers, Heideggerians, Buddhists, Catholics. Right? I think that as more Catholics become interested in exploring the resonances with the integral, we will see Catholic theologians from the past being presented as integral thinkers. And some of these we may never have heard of. For example, Pope Francis was influenced by the theologian Romano Guardini. And I confess I had never heard of him. Pope Francis actually went to Germany to study Romano Guardini. Okay, the name sounds Italian, but he immigrated to Germany when he was 1 and became a well-known philosopher and theologian in Germany. And then I found out that Guardini had some, his thought anyway had some influence on the encyclical. So I read a couple of his books, and he is a visionary of integralism. I don't think he's quoted at all in the Laudato Si, but he was a contemporary of Heidegger, and he shared many of the same concerns. Now, he was part of a group of theologians whose names may be more familiar to some of us, such as Louis Dupré, Jean Danielou, Yves Congar, and von Balthasar, who saw that the modern world was coming to a close and that Catholicism had something to contribute to the new world yet to be born. Their writing strongly influenced the Second Vatican Council and its spirit of aggiornamento, the spirit of change and open-mindedness. The way these theologians went about it, though, was by revisiting the sources within the Christian tradition that could shed light on the way forward. Most of these theologians were French. Before aggiornamento, there was to be a ressourcement. Congar became the lead consultant to the Second Vatican Council. The legacy of the council, however, was a political split between those who emphasized ressourcement and those who embraced aggiornamento. But ressourcement came to mean a defiant, and perhaps in Gebserian terms, a deficient mental insistence on Latin masses and no salvation outside the church. So not at all what these theologians were really about. So the future of Catholic integralism depends on the rapprochement between these two camps. Well, one can see such a rapprochement in the encyclical because the Pope bends over backwards to connect this new concern with the environment as a religious issue to traditional teachings and past proclamations by previous popes and bishops. Anyway, if this is a foretaste of things to come, I foresee a possible retrospective enlargement of the forerunners and contributors to integral theory in the coming years. There are an assortment of writers who have made explicit declarations in Christianity and integralism. The one I am more familiar with are Paul Smith, Jim Marion, and Tom Thresher. All three are Wilberians. Catholics might be understandably hesitant about cozying up with Wilber, but he does have one prominent monk in his camp, Thomas Keating. Wilber has strengthened his institute's offering on integral Christianity, so we should see something come out of that. Paul Smith is an interesting case. He's a Baptist minister, and he had been so for decades and brought his whole congregation with him into integral approach to practicing Christianity. So I'm going to pull a few quotes here from the encyclical. Not too many, but there are a few. Drawing on his namesake, St. Francis, Pope Francis says that an integral ecology calls for an openness to categories which transcend the language of mathematics and biology and take us to the heart of what it is to be human. And again, if we approach nature and environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we do no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on their immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. The poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. The encyclical emphasized the need to open up to the deeper ethical and spiritual dimension of the environmental crisis. For a resort to modern technocratic rationality is by itself unable to resolve the problems it itself is causing. Although again and again, the Pope appeals to an integral approach. He uses the word integral 24 times in the encyclical. And that's not counting other words like integration. Now it has become fashionable in environmental circles to regard Christianity as culpable in setting up the cultural conditions that made the environmental crisis possible. Ever since Lynn White wrote the widely read essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, published in the journal Science in 1967. Two arguments White made to accuse Christianity are the anthropocentrism of the Bible and the displacement of the pagan belief in the ensoulment of nature. Pope Francis seems to have this in mind when he writes, "We are not God. The earth was here before us, and it has been given to us. This allows us to respond to the charge that Judeo-Christian thinking, on the basis of the Genesis account which grants man dominion over the earth, has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by painting him as domineering and destructive by nature. This is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the Church. Although it is true that we Christians have at times incorrectly interpreted the Scriptures, nowadays we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute dominion or domination over other creatures. The biblical texts are to be read in the context with an appropriate hermeneutic, recognizing that they tell us to till and keep the garden of the world. Tilling refers to cultivating, plowing, or working, while keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. This implies a relationship of mutual responsibility between human beings and nature. Each community can take from the bounty of the earth whatever it needs for subsistence, but it also has a duty to protect the earth and to ensure its fruitfulness for coming generations. The earth is the Lord's, quoting Psalm 24. To him belongs the earth with all that is within it, Deuteronomy. Thus God rejects every claim to absolute ownership. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me, Leviticus. And in our time, the church does not simply state that other creatures are completely subordinated to the good of human beings as if they have no worth in themselves and can be treated as we wish. The German bishops have taught that where other creatures are concerned, we can speak of the priority of being over that of being useful. The Catechism clearly and forcefully criticizes a distorted anthropocentrism. Each creature possesses its own particular goodness and perfection. Each of the various creatures, willed in its own being, reflects in its own way a ray of God's infinite wisdom and goodness. Man must therefore respect the particular goodness of every creature to avoid any disordered use of things. So, the encyclical makes a pointed critique of the modern worldview. The language could be borrowed, from postmodernism, but it's post-secular, not dependent on a pre-modern return to the medieval worldview. Ecological culture cannot be reduced to I'm quoting again from the encyclical, to a series of urgent and partial responses to the immediate problems of pollution, environmental decay, and the depletion of natural resources. There needs to be a distinctive way of looking at this, a way of thinking, policies, an educational program, a lifestyle, and a spirituality which together generate resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm. Otherwise, even the best ecological initiatives can find themselves caught up in the same globalized logic. Francis points to an alternative. Yet we can once more broaden our vision. We have the freedom needed to limit and direct technology. We can put it at the service of another type of progress, one that is healthier, more human, more social, more integral. Perhaps taking another jab at white, Pope Francis finds that it is modern anthropocentrism with its reductionistic flattening of the world into resources that is much more environmentally destructive than the medieval form of it. Once the human being declares independence from reality and behaves with absolute dominion, the very foundations of our life begin to crumble. For, and here he's quoting Pope John Paul II, instead of carrying out his role as a cooperator with God in the work of creation, man sets himself up in place of God and thus ends up provoking a rebellion on the part of nature. Now I got three more quotes here and this is from the chapter 4, Integral Ecology. It cannot be emphasized enough that everything is interconnected. And we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. We urgently need humanism capable of bringing together the various fields of knowledge, including economics, in the service of more integral and integrating vision. So, as you can see, it's quite liberal with the word integral. The Vatican has stepped into onto the integral bandwagon, and it's urging its 1.2 billion adherents to do the same. Are you ready for this? Okay. Building upon the work of seminal authors of integralism, this society, this institute, the Wilberans, the Teilhards, and others have laid the foundation for the emergence of integral culture. Those of us tilling the field of integralism, however, still look out onto a world that is stubbornly modern. And we have probably all felt at one time or another like a voice calling out in the wilderness, to quote St. John, who was quoting Isaiah. We might soon see a lot of reinforcements join us. When I started writing this paper, I fully expected to be blowing the dust off my 3 volumes of his unbound writings that Thomas Berry had gifted me. However, truth be told, I did not see much of Thomas Berry in the encyclical. His spirit and that of the Teilhard de Chardin can be felt therein, but who really popped out of the pages of the encyclical was Romano Guardini, whose books I was concurrently reading. The 2 books I read were Letters from Lake Como and The End of the Modern World. In Letters from Lake Como, Guardini presents a very perceptive contrast between the organicity of the classical world and the mechanistic orientation of the modern world, which he witnessed during his vacations to Lake Como. He was living in Germany and spent summers in Lake Como. They had not been modernized like Germany was. And so he could see the transition between the classical world and the modern world taking place right there at Lake Como. In his book, Letters from Lake Como, he's very perceptive, he's like a phenomenologist, just very clear in what he sees going on. Its spirit is very evident in the encyclical. The End of the Modern World, published in the 50s, should be of special interest to students of integralism. His description of the different historical stages of culture parallel the structures of Jean Gebser. But the position he is coming from is decidedly more biblical. It doesn't say a lot about the integral structure. His view of the future could not be characterized as optimistic. He's not like saying, "Oh, goody, here comes the integral." And he doesn't call it the integral, but for purposes of, make clear what I'm talking about, I'm calling it the integral. If he calls it anything, it's salvation. Right? And he explicitly relates it to the meaning of it that is found in the Old Testament. Okay, it's a collective. Salvation is collective. It's not an individual thing, and it's terrestrial. Right? That what he's talking about is what, like St. Augustine, referred to as the city of God. It's something that it's going to come down almost. But it's wherever it comes from, it's going to be here. Right? It's earthly. It's not otherworldly. So that meaning of it in the Bible is that of a just society that conducts itself in right relation to God, the world, and the self. The modern contemporary culture is kind of at odds with that. So if one extrapolates from present conditions to the future, as Guardini did, he's pessimistic. However, culture is not predetermined. Culture is a spiritual thing. It's not something that, is mechanistic or it's just going to unfold automatically. It comes from free will, and the spirit is free. So because of the freedom of the spirit, God's grace can inspire humanity to see the error of its ways and elect to forswear its irresponsible use of power, thus averting the destructive path it is on. In other words, the integral must be chosen. It will not unfold automatically in some Hegelian fashion. The ability of present-day humans to choose the integral is hampered by its addiction to power over nature. This is a theme that is found in Guardini. Okay? Through the employment of ever more powerful machines. The abuse of power over things leads to a corresponding diminishment of power over self, abetted by increased bureaucratic control of society. The control of society is guided by various rational schemas. Humanity still believes it can save itself, independently of honoring its covenant with God. These incremental reforms will not prevent the further slide into destruction, for the issue of the right use versus the abuse of power has not been addressed, so long as man fails to recognize that responsible use of power can only be actualized through an inner metanoia, it's the Greek word for transformation of mind, that brings him into the relationship of being a steward of God. Until then, we can expect to see a further deterioration of the state of the world. Perhaps humanity is like those addicts who are unable to check their addiction to alcohol until they hit rock bottom and their life is in shambles. Unfortunately, this seems to be the way humanity is dealing with environmental degradation. There's much talk and various half measures taken, but the earth keeps deteriorating. And that's basically, while people are receiving this encyclical, they're just trying to shake us up, leaders, the world leaders, and just talking and doing something. Guardini does describe the integral person, whose metanoia puts her in right relation to God, self, and world, and forms the coming epoch. The salvific leap to a just world will not be inaugurated by a great leader, but through a whole new human structure. Like the addict in AA who comes to see that his life is unmanageable, the new man must come to a profound awareness of the dangers inherent in the present direction. Ultimately, our fate stems from free choice, and the new man acts to nurture and protect the freedom of tomorrow. The clear seeing of our precarious situation kindles a deep love for the world, and this inspires a chivalric orientation towards it. The new man, Guardini continues, will recover the appreciation for asceticism. There is no greatness that is not grounded deep in self-conquest and self-denial. The new man will cultivate the virtue of companionship and solidarity with those who stand shoulder to shoulder at the common task and common danger. The new man will express a realistic piety, a piety no longer operating in a separate realm of psychological interiority or religious idealism, but within reality. A reality which, because complete, is also the reality created, sustained, and willed by God. Guardini concedes that his view of the new man is by a man, and that a new woman, a woman might have a different view of the new man as well as the new woman. So I thought that was kind of ahead of his time. Guardini finishes the End of the Modern World with some practical policy recommendations. This is exactly what the encyclical does, but the encyclical, it's not so much a theoretical document, it's very practical. And so its recommendations are much more extensive than what Guardini supplies. But anyway, the stamp of Guardini on it is unmistakable. So to return to the question, can the West be integralized without Christianity? My conclusion is it's not going to happen. At least for the present, Pope Francis is galvanizing a Christian awakening, and this awakening is taking an integral form. Christianity is in our Western DNA, and it is furthermore taking on an invigorating form in the global South and parts of Asia. I don't think we need to be alarmed at the possibility that integralism will be taken over by the Catholic Church. In the encyclical, Pope Francis says several times, we are open to dialogue with everyone. And he did write the encyclical for everyone, not just the church. So I think we should take him up on that. Thank you.
Question, comment. Actually, Gregson did attend Guardini's lectures in Germany in mid-1920.
I was wondering about that, but I didn't get a chance to look it up yet.
It's something I want to do more research on myself. I was just going to ask, do you know what the status of Guardini's thought was, say, around 1925 to 1930?
Well, he became a leading theologian
Right.
in that time, and so the Nazis, kicked him out of Germany.
Right.
Yeah. So, but like I said, I'm very new to Guardini, and so I don't, I can't say much about it. But,
The other brief question I had, are you familiar with the passages in Gabriel where he talks about the essential Christian nature of the integral structure?
Is that a question?
Yes.
Is there?
Are you familiar with those passages?
No, actually, that's what I was hoping someone would bring up. No.
Yeah, there are these, at first it's kind of strange to see, but it does, towards the end of the Emperor's Origin, I forget the context, but he does mention the outcomes, the essentially Christian nature of the integral structure of consciousness. And that's all unusual. Seems to come out of, I was going to do that.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. I'm just starting to get into Thomas Taylor's work on secularism, and it's a mammoth book. But he makes it clear that secularism is a product of Christian culture, and so we could say modernism, is essentially a product of Christianity. And it's very uneasily saddled onto other cultures, and so I think that one could argue that Christianity is needed to overcome what it has created. I mean, or to set it right. So yeah. Yes.
Nice
Nice.
to meet you. I just wanted to thank you for this, and I was thinking when this stuff came out and emailed some people about this idea that something's going on in the world which is beyond the correspondence between certain teachers and scholars and conversations. The spirit of the world, maybe the sphere, maybe. For people in the Sharabina and the mother realm, it's so easy to say they're working from behind the scenes and make it all happen. That's not too odd to me to think. But it seems to me that, integralism is not going to take over the world. And if anything, all the other religions or systems are pushed into a more of a holistic and integral framework of evolutionary necessity. And it's interesting that this is not coming out in terms of this word and within Christianity, but it seems to me that the key of survival to any systems of thought and practice would be to really understand the idea of wholeness, whole person, and all of that. I wonder if you have any comments on that. I just feel that something beyond any individual and any mystic is happening that is what these mystics are connecting into and are we becoming more conscious of.
Yeah.
So this is really what's going on probably behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, I hope so. You know, that's why I say, you know, like, sometimes I feel like, oh man, you know, is there anybody, you know, watching or doing anything from the other side? But I think what's pushing it, one of the factors, the main factors that's pushing it is, you know, just the challenge of science. And that, you know, the churches have to come to terms with it. So, and, you know, the Catholic Church has been kind of resistant, you know, to modernism. You know, Teilhard said, don't resist. I mean, you know, let's do jiu-jitsu move with it, and because there's mysticism there in science, and it also is a product of Christianity. Let's go to the roots. I mean, it was, you know, it was religious. It wasn't atheistic, and you know, from the beginning. It was kind of later developed, and but dialoguing with science, as I said, that brings in other religions. You can't just talk from a denominational perspective. I mean, it's, you have to start talking about in more general terms, you know.
And science is also being pushed to thinking more integral.
Yeah.
More spiritual.
Right. Yeah. So I think integralism is the key. I think religion is going to see more and more that that's the case. If they're going to dialogue with science, they're going to have to take a more integral approach. Because they can't go back to the way they used to be. That's been defeated. Something like that might be going on in the global south, but not entirely. And still, that's kind of a different phenomenon. The global south, you know, Christianity in the global south. Because they're, you know, they still have a lot of the magical and the mythical energy that they're bringing into Christianity, and so, and then you have the global north, you know, it's been secularized and rationalized and modernized, and they're having a hard time dealing with those pagan converts, you know, who are bringing in more, you know, the other spectrums of consciousness. So I think integral is going to have to be the bridging point.
Yeah,
Yes.
do any of the theologians that you're looking at go back to the early church and even the teaching of Christ to look for the integral roots for Christianity? Do they go back to, are they looking at the early church?
Oh, the ratio small theologians?
And yeah, and also looking at the teaching of Christ.
Yeah.
And searching for the roots for integrality within the church.
Yeah.
They do that.
Well, I can't really speak for them. It's been a long time since I've been involved in that. I was a seminarian for a while, but the Catholic Church, you know, always emphasizes the magisterium, which means that the Bible and the tradition constantly needs to be reinterpreted. Yeah, and they're going to be reinterpreting it through the integral, you know, inspiration, I think. And I think you can find it for sure. And you know, it's so remarkable. Here we have the first pope by the name of Francis, you know, deliberately going back to St. Francis, who brought about a true revolution that in some ways, I mean, I don't know, I'm just speculating, it has an integral component because he started out very, very medieval, you know, with his asceticism and, you know, his, you know, what Rick Tarnas here called, you know, dualistic Christianity perspective. And, but he ends up with an exalted, a more exalted form of Christianity and sees that it's not, you know, it's not that, you know, the emphasis on sin and his Christology changed, you know, that Christ wasn't just performing an atonement for our sins, but it was his love. It was God's love for humanity. And I think that really plugs into the integral.
You might note that in the introduction to EPO, Gaither very explicitly says, I'm saying what Teilhard is saying.
What's that again? A little louder?
In the introduction to EPO, Gaither makes a statement, I can't quote it directly, but he basically says, what Teilhard is saying, I'm saying. Of course, there are differences, but
Oh,
it's a
yeah.
general
Yeah.
comment, and Teilhard,
Huh.
the two
Yeah.
systems of thought, the stasis differs between Teilhard and Gaither, but it's integral. But also, I would the invisible origin is a very spiritual document. Gaither's invisible origin, and there's much there. The achronon as an eschatological impulse.
Thank you, it was good. Well, thank you. Time's up.